It's a very peaceful afternoon here at St Dunstan's in Boltonsborough, and the reason I've come here is because this is the birthplace of St Dunstan and this church is named after him. There's been a church here for 1,000 years. One imagines it wasn't called St Dunstan when Dunstan was born. That would be a bit of a coincidence. This is Dunstan, who was an absolute rock star 1,000 years ago. He was the one who took over Glastonbury Abbey, turned it into a really wealthy established Benedictine monastery, which then became very wealthy over the next 500 years until it all came crashing down in the 1530s. He was also somebody who crowned kings and did lots of other things as well. We're going to find out a little bit about him. And this church, which is not one of the finest examples in the Church of England, I have to admit, is very humble compared to the reputation of Dunstan. So let's have a think about that. Guess where I am? I am miles away from Boltonsborough in Somerset. If I go around like that, you might be able to see where I am. That is Tower Bridge. I'm in London, the City of London, which is sort of different from the City of Westminster. And the reason I've come here is because I'm very close to a St Dunstan's church, which has had almost as much excitement and incident as St Dunstan himself. It's called St Dunstan's in the east. It's just over there. I've not been there yet. Should we go and have a look? Well, here I am. I've made it to St Dunstan's and we're going to go inside, except I've got a feeling that going inside is going to be a little bit harder than you might expect. Let's find out why. You've probably spotted the problem. You can't go inside because there is no inside. It's all outside. There used to be a roof. That's now gone, courtesy of the Luftwaffe in the Blitz in the 1940s. So what we've got left here is a kind of a derelict church. It's a church that was built in Saxon times. So there's probably a church here even before Dunstan was born. But he improved it. It wasn't named after him at that point, obviously, but quite soon after he died, it was named in his honour. And I think sometimes we think about the kind of the fervour that does that kind of thing, but of course we do that all the time. In the 1980s and 90s, there was barely a student union that wasn't named after Nelson Mandela, who was sort of one of the heroes of the age. So we're always forever taking heroes' names and applying them to buildings and institutions, and that's what's happened here. And there's an extraordinary history to this building, almost extraordinary as the life of Dunstan himself. This church was, improved, rebuilt, and of course particularly rebuilt by Sir Christopher Wren. That's one of the few remaining spires of Sir Christopher Wren, which was rebuilt after the Great Fire of London in 1666. So this fire, being in the City of London, was very badly damaged and then rebuilt. And then, of course, it stood as a church for hundreds of years thereafter. But, of course, it couldn't do anything about the Luftwaffe dropping bombs on the City of London. The roof went. But now what we've got left is this rather beautiful sort of urban park with an ecclesiastical theme that I think St Dunstan himself would actually rather like. And so we're going to take a little look at the life of St Dunstan now. Why would he be in favour of a place like this? So this is Glastonbury Abbey. It's been pretty ruined since 1539 when it was dissolved by Henry VIII. And the last abbot was a holdout, and he was hung, drawn and quartered on the Tor. And I made a video about Richard Whiting if you want to go and have a look at that. But this is Glastonbury Abbey, and Dunstan, born in about 909, came here as a child or as a young man to be educated. But it wasn't really much of a monastery then either. It had actually seen better days, and it was being run by some Irish monks. It was a bit more communal. Some of them had families. It didn't have that strict rigour and discipline that Dunstan was later to introduce. So he got educated here. He was the son of a wealthy, influential family. And he ended up in politics and advising the kings. But then he came back here when he was ousted from politics. I think he was accused of witchcraft, which would now go down extremely well in Glastonbury, modern day Glastonbury anyway. There are loads and loads of shops selling all kinds of witchcraft related things, which I personally find extremely distressing. Dunstan came back here in the 930s and became a monk. And then a few years later, he was elected to be abbot of this place. And then that's when the really big thing happens. He turns this into a Benedictine monastery. Now, Benedictine, the rule of St. Benedict was developed hundreds of years earlier, actually as a way of reforming the church in Rome and in Europe. And so he brought that in here, and it was a whole new regime, which was much stricter, and it involved all kinds of routines and daily prayer, much more rigorous. And so that's what happened here. And actually, it worked a treat. What it did do was it meant this is an extremely productive abbey. They went out, the monks went out and drained marshlands, created places for sheep to dwell. They became rich. There were satellite monasteries that became richer and richer, so that within a couple of hundred years, there were dozens and dozens of refreshed and revived Benedictine monasteries, and then other orders came in after that. So in a way, this was a revival of monasticism in the late 10th century, because there had been an earlier one, earlier in the Saxon period. So that kind of really starts here. It's quite exciting to be here for that. Then there's also the legacy of writing and books and literature. And so actually the writing of the English language is very much encoded and embedded here in Glastonbury, and lots of documents still remain from that time. And so yeah, Glastonbury itself just grew and grew in wealth and power, and was second only to Westminster Abbey in terms of wealth as well as influence. It's quite hard to spot on a day like today, but that in the far distance is Glastonbury Abbey, and we're actually in my garden. And that's why Glastonbury is always a special place for me, because I can see it from my office, and it represents this place of huge historical significance. Even though it's a small town, there's a dissolved abbey, and it's now much more famous for a music festival which happens over there. But I think Dunstan is part of that history that I find really interesting. And we've just been talking about Westminster and influence. And let's just wrap up by thinking about the influence that Dunstan had in his extremely long life. He lived into his 80s. And what ended up happening was he ended up becoming an advisor to kings. There are lots and lots of kings in the 900s in Anglo-Saxon England. They all begin with E or AE. They're quite hard to keep track of. They're often quite young kings, and they're boy kings. And what they need is a grown-up to look after them. Now, historically, these Anglo-Saxons would have been advised. These Anglo-Saxon kings would have had family members telling them what's what and how to act and that kind of thing. But actually Dunstan became that figure, so that he was the right-hand man, the chancellor, and what that ends up doing is planting the church right at the heart of English kingship in a way that I don't think it had quite been before as a church, rather than the faith of the king. So obviously King Alfred and Athelstan had a Christian faith, but we have slightly less Christian kings, but who are influenced by the church, and I think Dunstan is the one that starts that. So Dunstan becomes super famous, but actually he is then eclipsed by Thomas Becket in the 1170s, who was murdered, dramatic death, everybody loves that. The only reason that Becket, I think, really had been able to be both Chancellor of England and then Archbishop of Canterbury and hold those two things together is because of Dunstan, who was the one who provided that ballast. There are lots of stories about him as well. There are one or two immoral kings, one of whom he dragged out of bed with a mistress and possibly the mistress's mother soon after the coronation. And so there are lots of tales in which Dunstan becomes an authority figure, and he probably overplays his hand a few times by the sounds of it. He's a bit old for all this stuff, and everything maybe would have been easier if it had just been left to him. But he stayed in his lane. He became Archbishop of Canterbury under Edgar, and actually as Archbishop he then crowned Edgar King of England in Bath Abbey, and the coronation service that he put together for that is the basis for the coronation service that we still use to this very day, except of course that's now in Westminster Abbey. So Dunstan's fingerprints are all over English history, the ancient history and the modern history as well. So he really is an extremely important figure. And I think the thing that I'm just taking home and thinking about this is how important it is that the church is able to offer advice to rulers and to kings that maybe others can't. And actually, we often think about that on a national level. So we're thinking about bishops in the House of Lords or the things that archbishops do. Now, we're not bishops and archbishops, but actually the real place where all this stuff happens is in our towns, in our villages. And there are leaders and there are councillors and there are mayors and stuff. And maybe we should think, what as churches can we offer in terms of advice and help and support so that we can enrich a society in every way, not just financially, but in terms of creating a society that works for everyone. So anyway, Dunstan's given me a bit of an inspiration to think a bit about that. And I'm going to give you a moment now to have a think as I walk out of St Dunstan's Church. Just take that moment of quiet before the next video starts to have a bit of a think about how you could be a blessing to the people around you. But before you do that, let me tell you about my almanac. There's an article version of this that I've been talking about over at Cary's Almanac. There's a link below, and it's a weekly newsletter in which I go through the Christian liturgical calendar in England, which is where I live, from a bit of a Christian perspective. I hope that you find that interesting. But anyway, here I go. Take a moment just now as I walk out of the church to have a little think.